soldier to fight on the battlefield. So when we talk about a Socratic gift, you're talking about the courage to think, to examine, like a company. How do you, in fact, not just deal with cutthroat competition, but also create an environment where people can flower and flourish and bring to that environment the kind of distinctive gifts that they have, no matter what color, no matter what gender, no matter what sexual orientation or religion. That Socratic gift, courage to think for oneself, has everything to do, when it comes to black people, with coming to terms with forms of death. I know it might be difficult to talk about forms of death in a corporate context, because we don't want Home Depot to die. We want it to thrive. But the irony is that there's a sense in which, well, Plato says it well when he says, philosophy itself, love of wisdom, philosophia, is a meditation on and preparation for death. To philosophize is to learn how to die. He who learns how to die unlearns slavery. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is all of us as fallen, cracked vessels have certain assumptions and presuppositions that need to be critically examined. And when you let certain assumptions go, certain dogma go, it's a form of death in order for you to be reborn. There is no rebirth without death. There's no maturation without death. There's no development without death. Socratic examination means you have to look at yourself in such a way that you can be reborn daily, weekly, yearly, annually, in order to be better, more decent, more compassionate, more open, more tolerant, more cosmopolitan, more global, most importantly, more loving as a human being in a corporate context. And that's a great gift to black people. From the very beginning, you can just hear Frederick Douglass saying, "Yes, I see the U.S. Constitution. We the people, who do you have in mind?" Yes, I read the U.S. Constitution. I don't see any reference to the institution of slavery, but 22% of the inhabitants of the 13 colonies are enslaved Africans. Is this a conspiracy of silence? Is this a creative tension between principles and practice? Or is this hypocrisy and mendacity? And you recognize that sooner or later you're going to have to come to terms with what you are denying. Chickens come home to roost. You're going to reap what you sow. That's Douglass. I can appreciate the founding fathers, heroic in the face of the British Empire. But so many of them slaveholders themselves, are they open to maturation? Is it not the case that bigotry must die? Is it not the case that racial hatred must die in order for American democracy to fully live? Dogmas like white supremacy, male supremacy, anti-Jewish sensibility, anti-Arab sensibility must, if not be murdered, must be thoroughly contained in such a way that the better angels of each of us can flower and flourish. It takes courage to raise those kinds of questions with the kind of prudential judgment, so people will still listen, but at the same time be unhoused and unnerved. It's a great gift. And you see, in America, it's very difficult to do that because there's a sense in which, Henry James called America a hotel civilization. One reason why he left America and went to Britain and wrote his finest novels. He said America's a hotel civilization because it's a magnificent experiment, not just in democracy, but in putting a premium on technological ingenuity. But like a hotel, people tend to think the lights are always on, that there's no night side, there's no underside. You all put me in a nice hotel, and I appreciate that. I won't take this thing too far. But of course, I don't confuse my comfort, my convenience, my contentment in the hotel with all of Atlanta. I know there's social misery in Atlanta. I notice folks struggling against the grain in Atlanta. But when you're in a hotel civilization, you become so preoccupied with your own comfort and convenience that you end up acting as if there's no such thing as forms of darkness. So that the U.S. Constitution in some ways denies American slavery. See, That's a death-dodging move, because slavery is a form of social death. To be enslaved is to be socially dead. You have no legal status at all. You have no rights. You have no control over property or territory. You're just a commodity to be bought and sold and worked. You see. In the same way, Jim Crow and Jane Crow is a form of civic death. You're not a full-fledged citizen. You're part of the body politic, but you're civically dead, though economically alive for exploitation and so forth. Or to be taught to hate oneself, the way African peoples have been taught. That we're less intelligent, we're less beautiful, we're less moral. To feel inferior, that's a form of psychic death. And then spiritual death, my God, we see it these days so much in these chocolate cities tied to the prison industrial complex with these disgraceful school systems. And weak families, and fathers drifting too often, and mothers overworked and underpaid. Spiritual death, helplessness, hopelessness, lovelessness, even touchlessness. Young kids not even touched in a loving way. It's alien to me. I didn't grow up that way. I grew up in a neighborhood, not a hood. It was a black neighborhood, but it wasn't a hood. We had ties of empathy. We had bonds of sympathy. We didn't have survival of the slickest. It wasn't social Darwinian space. Everybody preoccupied with the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. No, I didn't grow up in a neighborhood like that. So we were struggling with the legacies of social death, American slavery, civic death, Jim Crow, Jane Crow. At least Jim and Jane Crow Sr. We still got a lot of Jim Crow Jr. around. In terms of de facto segregation, who we spend time with, which churches and mosques we go to, which synagogues we might go to, how we socialize and so forth. Residential patterns. Still de facto segregation in a certain sense, but it's not legalized, thank God. Thank God. 1960s, all of those courageous citizens came together and broke the back of American apartheid and shattered Jim Crow and Jane Crow Sr. But the psychic death, and this is why I spend so much time in prisons and high schools and dealing with the music and hip-hop culture and so forth. Because the psychic death is still there. And the spiritual death cuts deep. It coarsens the conscience and hardens the heart. Makes the heart icy in that sense. So when we talk about the Socratic gift of black folk, we're talking about what it really means to be on intimate terms with forms of death in a civilization that's often death dodging and death ducking, denying those realities. Sometimes you got to check yourself and say, am I out of tune with reality, or is the reality that is in place somehow far removed from mine? How do I negotiate that? How do I navigate that? How do I create affinity groups in such a way that I'm empowered in a manner that allows me to flower and flourish in a corporate context, and yet at